Hey everyone, welcome back to the Power Baseball League. We're just come off of two great conversations. We just talked to Phil about forms processing and all the cool ways we can use AI to bring data into the system. And we also talked with Megan B. Walker all about how to use customer voice and forms that we can collect data and then do some kind of automation with that. So, Malcolm, what do you think we should do next, or where
Well,
should we start?
yeah, those are both really cool conversations. Super cool to see just the capabilities that have come around and what you can do. So after we did those sessions and had those conversations, I was reflecting around just what do we have, and there was sort of three knowns that came up in our fictitious example of a scenario here as an organization. We've got historical data that's buried in spreadsheets, right? We've talked about that all along. That's how we've been managing everything to date. So we've got some of that. And then we've got new applications that are coming in. We know some people don't have access to computers or forms and can't do a form. So we know we're going to have some paper forms. So the forms processing would be appealing. And then we know there's an appetite for being as efficient as we possibly can, which really would be like giving the power to the consumer, if you will, and let's put it in their hands to fill out a web form and have Power Automate bring everything into CDS properly and all that. So I think we can dive into I think we need to rather deal with all three of those and set all three things up.
Perfect. So I think that's a great setup for the next things that we're going to talk about. We'll start with how to do the data import. Then we'll try and work on setting up our own version of forms processing and then set up customer voice. So Malcolm, I'll let you take it away with data import.
I'm on it. Okay, welcome back, everybody. So as Kylie and I just talked about, we got a couple of different options with respect to how we can bring our data in the system. So today, I'm going to talk to you about good old school import. So out of the system, or out of the box rather, option for bringing data in the system. Obviously, a manual job requires some effort in terms of getting your files together. So I want to walk you through what I've done to kind of get a couple of files of our historical registrations and contacts together, and how we're going to then pull that together, parse it, and bring it into the system, again, using the out-of-the-box method. So let's dive right in. I'm going to jump off screen here and share my screen, and we will hop in. All right, so we've got our Power Baseball League system up. Now we're going to start this in our sandbox environment because we want to do a quick import, make sure everything goes smoothly, make sure everything's working properly. As you can see here, we've got a couple of test records in here just to get things rolling. We were using these to just make sure that we had our proper fields set up. So I want to give you a quick overview of what our record is going to look like. And so I'll pop open our parent test record. You'll see we've got a handful of fields, some basic information around how to contact information and all that good stuff, as well as their contact preferences on the right-hand side, any registrations that we have for them in here. We've got the timeline built in. So still some work to be done on the form itself, but we're ready to bring some data in, and then we can start to massage the form a little bit more with some minor tweaks that we want to make, maybe move some stuff around, add some spacers and so on. So what you'll notice is we've got a couple of different types. And so as I change the type here, our fields are going to change on the form. So we've got some basic business rule logic built in just to help control that. Right now, we're really going to focus on caregivers and youth. So we're bringing those in first. So what we've got, if we look at our import files, is we've taken our historical data. So as you know, this is a fictitious endeavor, right? This isn't a real scenario, but we've made up some fields and some records to give us some data, because in our example, in our fictitious story, we've got an organization that's got years of historical data. And so if you think about what that looks like for an organization, you've got lots of different files built up over time, probably multiple workbooks. It's a pretty common scenario, right? In organizations that maybe haven't had a system before, we've got this scenario where we've got all this data. And so we can actually massage a lot of that data and bring it in. And so what we've done to prepare for this is taken a little sample of that historical data just to make sure that we've got the ability to get the import up and running. And then we'll turn our attention to a much larger data set, bring over, probably hundreds or maybe even thousands of records, depending on how far back we're going. And so we've got two different types of data that we're going to work on today. We've got our contact data and our registration data. And so there is a sequence and an order that we need to bring this data in. So if you think of the logic of the system from one of the previous videos, what we had set up is we have your contacts, and those contacts, as I just showed you, can be a parent or a caregiver, can be a child, or it can be a coach. And so that's controlled by that contact type you see in the background. Our registration record then gets attached, right? So that's a related record to our contact. And it's a one-to-many relationship because one contact can have multiple registrations, right? If you think of a sports league, kids or youth come back year after year to play. So every year they're going to have a new registration. And that registration is far more simplistic than a full-on like application to get them enrolled in the program. It's just an expression of interest for the next season, maybe collect some payment information and so on. So that's basically what we have here. I'm going to open this sheet up for you. I'll just drag it over here. And so what you can see is we've got some data and we've structured it in a way to allow the import to work in the proper sequence. And what I mean by that is we've got all of our caregivers at the top, and those are going to all come in as that caregiver record. And then we've got our youth coming in, and you'll notice that the youth records are then going to look up a record. So if you jump back, and sorry for bouncing around, but if we look at a child record, you're going to notice that we've got on here a lookup to that primary caregiver. And so because of that relationship between these two records, same record type, so we can bring in it all at once, but we do have to make sure it's structured properly. If this were flipped over in terms of these records being at the top, we probably would run into some issues because the import sequence is going to run through these records just as you see it here. And in order for this record to come in, Sally Smith has to exist first. And so if we had this flipped, we probably would see an error on all of these because it's going to come up with an error that it cannot resolve that lookup because it doesn't exist in the system. Okay, so that's part of why we have it structured the way we do. You'll also notice that we have some information on the parent or caregiver records, but we don't necessarily have that. Now, every organization is going to be different in how you collect this. We're taking a simplistic approach in how we're structuring this. So you'll see the contact preferences on the far right of this sheet are applicable only to the parent, and that's because that's who we're going to have contact with. We don't necessarily have that level of detail on the contact records of the youth because we're not necessarily contacting them. We're dealing with the parents on behalf of the kids. All right, so that's data set number one. Data set number two is our registration data. So you'll notice a much more simplistic data set. This maps right into our application records. And you'll see we've got the applicant name, what season they're applying to, how much they paid, override created on, which we're going to revisit in a little bit later, and what level they're playing. Another thing I want to point out is the level is actually division in the system. This is on purpose because when we go through the import, I want to show you how these two pieces work, how we actually map that data in. So we are all ready to jump into our import. So I'm going to hop over into, I would go here in advanced settings, which would bring us into data management. And in the data management, there is the imports option. So here we go, data management, imports. Sorry, I did that kind of in a confusing way, but here we are back at the same screen. So we're now at the import stage. We are ready to bring that data in. I'm going to go ahead and pick that record. And so I'm going to walk you through what all these screens are and how they all work. So I'm going to go ahead and pick the file I want. You'll notice, maybe you won't actually, but looking at these are CSV files. When we're bringing data in for the first time, CSV is the way to go. If you're bringing data in after you've exported it, so let's say you've got data in the system and you export a batch of that data, you can actually make some edits in Excel and then put that data back in via the import process. You can use an XLS or an XLSX form or data type for that. But for first-time data, bringing it in the system, we're going to use our CSV files. I'm going to go about this very intentionally, right? Contacts first, then registrations. And again, that's because we cannot bring a registration in because it's going to have a lookup to a contact. If the contacts don't exist, that lookup is going to fail, that import's going to fail. So contacts first, go ahead and open that. It's got our file. We'll say next, it's just going to give us some verification. Yes, I uploaded this file. You do have the ability to zip files together and bring them in that way. We're not going to tackle that today, but that is something that you might want to look up if you're bringing in a lot of data. You can parse that data into different sheets, put it into a zip file, and bring it in that way. I'm going to say next. It's going to ask me how I want to map this. Now, because this is the first import we've done, we don't have any saved maps. We do have the ability to save the map if we're going to be doing a repetitive process over time. Super handy function. I'm going to show you what that looks like in a minute. So now it's saying, okay, we've got this file, but we don't recognize where you're trying to put it, right? So I have no idea what this PBL contacts is. We know that this is just contacts. So this is our source file. This is our record types in D365. I'm going to go ahead and pull up the contact, and you'll see now we get a green check mark. I say, got it. It said the system's now saying, I see what you're doing. You're bringing this data set over into the contact entity. Go ahead and say next. We're now going to deal with some mapping. So there's always going to be, or there's potentially always going to be an opportunity to go through and map things together. Now, in an ideal world, your map is perfectly set up. All your headers on your sheet, your import sheet, match fields in Dynamics, and the values of those fields match the values in Dynamics. So for example, if you have a pick list, your values in your import sheet have to match identically in order for this to come up green check mark right off the bat. It's not, I don't want to say it's not often that happens, but there's usually something you need to tweak as you go through the import process. So no big deal, we can go through that. You can see all of these have already been mapped. This one comes up, contact method. So what this is saying to us is, I don't know where you're trying to put this data, right? So can you show me where we want to put it? So it, out of the box, is going to say, I haven't mapped it. I'm going to give you this little exclamation point saying like, caution, this isn't being mapped, so I can't bring this data in if you try and import me. So I'm going to go ahead and pull this up. I know that that's actually called the preferred method of contact field. I'm going to go ahead and say that's the field. And you'll notice now we have this screen that's showing us where we can map data. So my pick list values in my spreadsheet map perfectly. So because of that, any is going to map to any, email to email, phone to phone. I would come in here and say, do not allow bulk email. So I'm going to do a search, do not allow bulk email. Now this is an interesting one. This field's a little bit different. It doesn't do the, oh, it does, I'm sorry. I should edit that out. The previous import test that I did, that actually came up as a yes, no value, which actually caught me off guard. So here it's saying allow, that's great. We're going to leave that as is. Do not allow emails. So we're going to say do not allow emails. There it is. It's got allow and do not allow. You'll notice this one has both options. The other one didn't. That's because the import sheet didn't have a value for do not allow. So it doesn't need to map it because it doesn't see that value in the sheet. On this one, we did have some of those records that said do not allow email communication. So we have that setting mapped in here. I'm going to go ahead and do the same for the last few fields here. I'm going to go through this rather quickly. Okay, do not allow phone calls. Okay, and so now we've mapped all of our fields, and you'll see this changed, right? It's now saying, okay, green means go. We're good to go. We've got everything mapped properly. Proceed. So I'm going to say next. If you want, you can poke through these. You can look through all the things. You can actually do some really neat tricks with respect to mapping to different areas. If you're bringing in a record type and you don't know how to map it, maybe you have duplicate contacts, like two people with the same name, but they are in fact two different people. If you're bringing in other data, you can actually map using things like a unique identifier or an email address. Really, really handy stuff. We're not digging into that today, maybe in a future video, but there's some great blog articles out there. If you just do a search for how to import scenarios like that, you'll find it. I'm going to say next. It's going to confirm, okay, we're bringing this data into contact, just making sure we want to do that. Say next. And we get to what is essentially the last set of questions. We've got allow duplicates, yes or no. So that's entirely dependent on what you're bringing in, right? In this scenario, I don't want any duplicates. If I happen to have duplicates in my spreadsheet, which in my small sample here, unlikely, but in a big sheet with hundreds or thousands of records, very possible. And if I want to make sure that we're bringing clean data in, I'm going to say, no, don't bring any duplicates. Bounce those duplicates out so that I can deal with them manually if need be. You could say yes, in which case it doesn't matter if it sees a duplicate, it's going to do its thing. Also worth noting the text here. This is based on your duplicate detection settings that you have. So it's going to look for duplicates in line with the rules that you have set up. Okay. Select an owner for imported records. So if your import sheet does not have an owner field, this is going to be who they own or who is owned who the owner will be. And so you can set this up just to be, it's almost like a fallback, right? If we don't find the right owner, what do we do with that data? Put it to this person, right? And this is our data map. So we could save this. We could call this PBL contacts. And I'm going to show you on the registrations data. You'll see when we get to that map screen, we actually have this as an option, right? So I'm going to go ahead and I like to date everything. So I'm going to go ahead and say the proper date here. Close to Halloween. I said to Kylie, oh, I'm going to do this video close to Halloween. Nobody likes data migration. It's kind of fitting that we're in a Halloween time and we're tackling this scary thing. She told me not to say that because it was corny. And now that I've said it out loud, I wholeheartedly agree with her. I'm going to go ahead and submit. It's going to submit that data for import. It's confirming that it's done. I'm going to finish. And we now see this show up on the screen as a record for import. So now what's going to happen, now this is a pretty small data set, so this is going to happen pretty quickly, but this can take some time, right? If you have hundreds or thousands of records being imported, it's going to go through a parsing process where it's taking the delimiter settings, reading through your data, making sure there's no errors. It's going to transform all that data, getting it ready to bring it in. It's then going to import the data. And so if there were any errors through that parsing and transforming, you're going to see those errors pop up here and it'll show you an error. Now we're pretty fortunate. We've got a 100% accuracy here. That's kind of rare when it comes to importing, right? Especially when you're dealing with mass volumes. If there's always going to be the potential for a few little errors, you can actually open this up and see what those errors are. So we could come in here and you can see there's a failure section and I would be able to look up all the records and you can actually even export those error rows. So if you got some errors because maybe the date format was wrong, you can actually export just the error files, fix the date in that Excel document, and then re-import that and say, okay, I caught the errors, fix them, and away we go. Okay. So we got lucky here. We didn't get any errors. That's great. We're going to go ahead and move into our second data set. Actually, let me just show you really quickly. If we come back to contacts, there's all of our contacts. We've got parents and guardians, and we've got the children in here as well. Okay, so that's great news. Now we're going to go ahead and bring in that registration data. So I'm going to do the same process. Choose file. I'm going to pick our registrations. I'm going to map everything together. So I'm going to confirm, yes, that's what I'm doing. Here's our map. This is the contact we just set up. Now, naturally, we're bringing in a different data set. So that map has nothing to do with what we're doing now. But if we were bringing in a second batch of contacts, I could use this mapping that I saved, and it would take all the same settings that I just showed it, and it would append those to this import. Where we would run into some trouble is if there were maybe values. So you'll remember a minute ago I talked about how there was a allow and do not allow on some of them, but not all of them. If we had in our second data set some of those values, it would then pop that up and say, okay, great, I used your map, but I need you to fix this because we don't have that value mapped in your previous data template here. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and say automatic mapping. I'm going to say next, and we run into the same scenario, right? What are you trying to bring in here? I'm going to say it's registration records. I'm going to go ahead and try and map, and we've got amount paid, applicant, season applied. Those are fine. However, it doesn't understand level. Why? Because level isn't actually a thing. It's actually called division. And so we actually have the ability, even though our headers are wrong, right? They're not named properly. We have the ability to override that as we're bringing it in, which is a really handy feature because sometimes, especially in big data sets, when you've got this huge spreadsheet, maybe a column is off by, it could be even a letter. And so that's a silly reason to have to scrap the whole thing and start back with that sheet and fix the header. Instead, you can actually say, oh, what I meant was we're going to map that to division. We see our values align perfectly, intermediate, junior, senior. Override created on. So this is a really neat little trick when you're dealing with historical data and trying to bring historical stuff into the system. The applications that I received in our Power Baseball League example that we're using today, they are from weeks or months ago, right? Maybe I've collected them over the last month and now I'm just trying to bring them all into the system. And so using the override created on is going to give you this error or this flag. And all you have to do is say, bring it to the created on field. What that will do is it will override the system's automated stamp of the date, the current date for when that record's being created. And it's going to actually override with whatever you have in your spreadsheet. So I don't know if you caught it, but if you scroll back in the video a little bit, when we pulled up that registration data, there was a whole bunch of historical dates from previous months. So those dates are actually going to come into the system exactly as I have them in the spreadsheet, instead of the system saying today, October the 15th, is the day that all these records were created. So it's a really handy feature when you're bringing stuff in if you want that historical perspective of when did this record get this application or this registration get created. Okay. Semantically, you could get into an argument about, well, no, technically the created on date for that CRM record is today, but I'll spare you that argument. So override created on maps to created on. We now see green. We're good to go. I'm going to say next, confirm our data. I'm going to say yes or no for duplicates. So in this scenario, I'm going to say yes to allow duplicates. And that's because registrations, absolutely, we could have multiple, right? And again, it depends on the duplicate detection settings. But if I said, don't allow me to have a registration for the same child in the same year, and we did in our spreadsheet, it would prevent that, right? I'm going to go ahead and leave these. I'm going to leave the map as well. Go ahead and submit. Confirm that it's done. I'm just going to give a couple of quick refreshes here. It's submitted. Now, when you're testing things like this in the sandbox, definitely things can go slower because the sandboxes tend to operate a little bit slower than production. But this, as I said earlier, especially when you're dealing with big data sets, this whole parsing, importing, transforming, importing process can take some time. There we have it. In the time I said all that, we've got our records imported. If I open this record up again, I'm going to see any of the successful records. So here are all of our registrations that were brought in. Of course, I can also go back to our contacts. And if I pick one of our contacts, I'm now going to see that we've got a registration record in for Nick Thomas, right? Our youth. It mapped perfectly to Kyle, the parent caregiver for this person. I see my registration. And again, as you see this here, there's obviously still some work to do, right? We've got this last reg date and the last reg division. We want that updated every time a new application is brought in. So we still need to build out some flows to help us with that, or some workflow, depending on how we want to do it, just to help us say, oh, we've got a new registration. Let's update the last reg division and last reg date, just so that we have that visible on the field. Right, so in theory, probably should have built that out before we did the importing, but we wanted to make sure you understood how we were getting data into our Power Baseball League management system. So there you have it. That is all I have to share with you with respect to importing data. I hope that's been helpful. If you have any questions, please feel free to comment on the blog or on the social posts, and stay tuned for more, because we're going to talk about that forms processing stuff. We're going to talk about building out a web form, some really cool stuff coming up in the next few weeks and few videos as we continue to work towards building out a robust Power Baseball League data management system. That's a mouthful. So stay tuned for more. We appreciate you watching. Have a great day.